Welcome to the podcast Artificial Art. My name is Steinar Jeffs. I'm a musician and a music teacher, and in this podcast I'll be interviewing guests about technology and creativity. So hi and welcome, Valerio Velardo. I'll give a brief introduction of you first. You are an AI music engineer, entrepreneur, and researcher. You have a PhD in AI music, and you've studied both music composition and piano performance, as well as astrophysics. You're the founder of an AI music ecosystem called the Sound of AI. So it's great to have you. And I was wondering if you could start us off by telling us your backstory, how this all began, this interest in music and AI, and maybe you can go on and tell us something about your current and previous activities.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure, really. And in terms of like how I got like where I am like right now, it's a little bit of a journey, I have to say. So I've always been super interested like in music. It's my number one passion. And I started to play piano, classical piano, since I was like a kid, really, right? And so there I started like to, as I said, like playing piano, training as a classical pianist. From there, I moved on to like music composition and then to conducting. But at the same time, I've always been interested in the more technical, scientific side of things. And because of that, I studied like physics. And I've always been involved in programming, really, right? Since I was a teen, more or less. And then after that, at some point, I thought, okay, so how can I combine these two huge passions of mine? So the scientific side, technical side on the one end, and on the other end of the spectrum, the more like artistic, creative. And that's when I basically decided to exploring how I could teach machines to be creative. So in other words, how I could generate music using machines or artificial intelligence. And so this is a journey that started for me like in my very early 20s, I have to say 20, when I was like that age, more or less. And then after a while, I started to like study like quite a lot. And after that, basically decided to do a PhD. I left Italy. So I'm originally from Italy. So after like all my degrees, then I moved on to the UK, where at the University of Huddersfield, I did a PhD which was basically like in between the music department and computer science department. And I basically did a lot of research in generative music at that point. And so once I'm done with that, the next step was, okay, so what do I do now? So I have like a PhD. So I had like a couple of directions in front of me. One was just staying in academia. And the other one was, why not start a startup company leveraging like all the research that I've done? And that's basically what I did. So I found a couple of guys, and together we started a company called Melodrive. And at Melodrive, basically we built a really cool real-time generative music system that can generate music for video games. And it has like one feature that's very, very unique to it, or it was very unique to it, which was generating music in real time that adapts to the sort of emotional context of a video game. So I'm going to give you an example. So you have like this music that gets generated in real time. If you are relaxing, like for example, with your character on a beach, then the very same musical themes are going to be played in a very relaxed manner. But all of a sudden there's a monster that comes over and starts kicking you, then probably you're going to hear like the very same musical themes, but now they're going to be transposed into a more aggressive style, for example, right? And so we basically like built this engine, this music engine, and it worked like actually well. And this was like before all the buzz, like that we currently have like with AI music, right? So it was like back in 2016, and at some point, like we did like the typical things that you do like with a startup company, like Silicon Valley life. So we went to Silicon Valley, went through like an accelerator there, which was really cool, super educational at the same time. So we raised some capital, came back to Berlin, and there we just like continued like for a few years. And at some point, we just like moved on like, to other things. And I worked like for a couple of companies as head of like machine learning operation. It was like a music tech company, as like senior AI music like researcher. And then after that, I started to work like on the sound of AI, which is basically um, an ecosystem really where uh, I do like a lot of things related to AI music. So it started as a simple YouTube channel where I would just like share my passion and knowledge of AI music and all things audio, really beyond music, right? But the important thing was like to do things at the crossroads, like of artificial intelligence and audio music things. And after that, I saw like that there was like some significant interest within the niche. And so I started the Slack channel, which became the Sound of AI Slack community. Now it's quite strong, like with almost 10,000 like people in there. Like it's very active. It's a very friendly community. And then with this community, we started to do really cool things. Like for example, a project which we called the Open Source Research Project, where basically we had like more than 150 to 200 people like, from all over the world contributing to a research project. So we had like 7 different research groups with their leaders and everything, with project managers. And so we managed to basically like create a really cool piece of software, which was like an AI model that could generate sounds with vocal inputs. So, like for example, give me a Jimi Hendrix guitar sound, right? And like this model would give you that. And the really cool thing is that at the end we also published this paper because we sort of like synthesized, like summarized all the research that we did into a paper, and we published that in a very important generative music conference. And from there, like we started doing like a lot of other things, like hackathons. Currently, like we run like this generative music AI workshop, like in collaboration with the music technology group at University Pompeu Fabra. So yeah, it's been quite active. And at the same time, I've been doing a lot of consulting in the space, AI music space, and advisorship, and also recruitment, like of AI music talents. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
You're a busy guy, Valerio. It sounds like, and have been busy for a while now, I guess. And there's a few things I'm thinking about as you tell your backstory. First of all, your YouTube channel, The Sound of AI. That's how I found you in the first place. And I would just recommend anyone listening to go check that channel out because it's really good, really informative. And you
Yeah,
have
thank you for that.
a lot of educational videos on how AI works and how you can also leverage it for yourself. You seem quite intent on the idea of open source and
Oh yeah.
and building things from the ground up, like a grassroots movement. Is that kind of a philosophy you live by?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it is something that we should all embrace, especially now like, with this new technological revolution that is like the AI revolution. And in our specific niche, it's going to be the AI music revolution, right? And I think open source is going to be instrumental in order to sort of like give back control, especially to copyright holders. In our case, right, generative music or AI music in general, we've seen a lot of, well, not a lot, but a few companies right now that are sort of like the flagship companies in generative music AI these days that are not necessarily being super transparent with the type of data like, that they're using, and also the type of sort of like relationship that they have like with the copyright holders. It's not really that clear whether they're using copyrighted data for training their generative music models, and if they do, whether they have consent and whether they are sort of like paying for that right, like for that privilege of using that type of music. So because of that, I go by, let's say, like I follow a certain, let's say, a few principles. Like for me, whenever I work like in generative music, I think the most important thing, first of all, is consent. So basically, making the copyright holders aware of the work that I'm doing and getting like the green light from them, so that I know that I'm doing something like that. The people who actually created that data that I'm currently using are actually okay with whatever I'm doing. So that is number one thing, and along with that goes the part of like transparency, right? So you need to be transparent. And I think like this is a huge problem in the industry, not just the music industry, but the industry at large. Take ChatGPT, for example, right? So I remember like there was like this really cool interview with like OpenAI CTO, right? And there was like the interviewer asking the CTO what type of data they use for training Sora, which is this really, really cool experimental model, text to video model generation. And the CTO was like completely shocked in a sense, like by the question, and she couldn't really utter an answer, a proper answer to that question, right? And that speaks volumes in and of itself, right? So it has happened with ChatGPT. So basically using whatever type of text found in the internet and elsewhere. And probably it's happening right now with like music AI companies. And I believe that this is a huge problem. So transparency is a necessary step. We need to know the type of data that these huge models have been trained on. So I think like it is like a very ethical point for me to respect. And then obviously there's a third point, which is that of paying copyright holders. So if I build a generative music system and I'm going to monetize it, I think it's only ethical for me or my company or my institution to actually send some of the revenues or the profits like that I get out of that model to the copyright holders that I have leveraged, who have leveraged in order to generate or to actually implement that particular generative model. And there's a fourth point, and now we sort of like loop back to your question regarding open source. I think open source, it is extremely important because in a world where AI is going to sort of transform everything or most of the things that we already know, I think it is extremely important to have models that we can really trust and models that will be reliable. And the only way for that to have like that level of trust in the models is if these models are publicly available, let's say like on GitHub, on like code repositories, so for everybody to check them and to play around with them. Now, obviously, I know that it is extremely important for companies to make profits. Of course, like it's their main goal, right? So what I sort of like suggest is to, of course, on the one hand, try to have open source models, but on the other hand, like what you can do is basically like don't allow third parties to use those models if they want to commercialize those models. So for me, the most important thing is that those models will be available out there for everybody like, to see and check. But then, of course, commercialization is another story. So I think like that is something like that companies should do, and third parties shouldn't be able like, to use those models in order to commercialize them, unless of course like you're fully open source. But that is like another type of like category, like a startup, and it's something different. But for your typical AI company, I think like open source should be like a foundational like step, but at the same time you should save commercialization for yourself.
Okay. Another thing I was thinking about while we were talking about your background was the model you made where you could input sound and then get the Jimi Hendrix sound out of it. That was an open source thing, right?
Yeah, of course.
So is it still available? Could our listeners try it for themselves?
Yeah, so basically it's in a GitHub repository. So you can just go there. So we have a website there, right? So where we just like put a lot of information about the entire process there. So I'm going to share a link with you like later so that you can just like, and from there you also have access to the code. And there was like one of these research groups, which was, or subgroups, I should say, which was responsible for creating an interface so that you can also like play around with it like through an interface, which is like quite cool. And we also have like a companion website where you can hear some of the sounds generated. Some of those like are quite canonical, whereas like others like are quite out there, I should say,
Yeah.
right? They're really, really weird sounds, but everything is open source, yes.
Cool. So in the generative music space, there's kind of two giants at the moment. It feels like Suno and Udio. At least that's what generally people are telling me about. And one comment that's often made is that they tend to make like generic music, kind of boring music, a lot of people say. What would you consider the forefront or cutting edge, like artistically, in the AI space at the moment?
Yeah, I think probably out of all the companies that are actively producing these models out there, like the demo that impressed me the most was the one from 11 Labs. It seems to me that they had a little bit of a quantum leap if you compare their model against Suno's and Udio's models, for sure. I think like the music is way more coherent, a little bit more creative, if you want, if you just like let me pass like that word in this context. And also the overall quality in terms of like the audio fidelity is higher. So out of the current text to music models, I would say like that 11 Labs is the one that impressed me the most. But I'm not necessarily super keen on these type of models. We're talking about text to music models. So in other words, you input some music description, like for example, hey, generate a Jimi Hendrix well, you shouldn't be really able to do that because of copyright reasons, but let's assume you could. You would like write something like, hey, generate something in the style of Jimi Hendrix with these lyrics, and that has a guitar solo or a ukulele solo, and that's it. Now, I think this is like quite impressive, especially for your typical internet, right? So like your typical internet user, like for them, this is like fantastic. Imagine you are on TikTok and you want to create like some music that's unique and customized for whatever like TikTok like you've created or Instagram story. I mean, like, that's fantastic. And it taps into this idea of user generated content, which is really, really nice. But the musician in me tells me that this is not really the most exciting application of artificial intelligence within the music environment. What I strive for instead is to try to create models that can augment musicians. And by musicians, I mean both professionals and semi-professionals or amateurs. I think there's a whole world to discover. Like, for example, the opportunity of augmenting and streamlining music generation, well, music composition, I should say, right? Or music production. And imagine you have a model that can help you come up with new like melodic ideas or harmonizations or accompaniment, so that at the end of the day you'll be a little bit like a film director who can work at the high level and then have all the sorry about that. Sorry about that. Yeah. So I'll just like go ahead. So imagine you can basically like come up with a lot of like melodic ideas and then harmonizations or just like accompaniment. So what those AI models will do for you is basically just like streamlining the process and let you be a sort of like film director. And instead of like taking care of all the minutiae in the music, you can think of the higher level concepts and then having the model actually filling up like all the tiny little details for you. And this will streamline your compositional and production process quite a lot. And this is really something that I'm striving for, this type of implementations of artificial intelligence in the music space.
And in some of your YouTube videos, you talk about this combination of symbolic and more like machine learning type of AI. And you use this word neuro-symbolic integration.
Yeah.
Could you explain what that is and what it potentially could do to musicians, or for musicians, I mean?
Yeah, of course. So I feel like I have to give you a little bit of context here, like to get into neurosymbolic integration. So right now, the way we generate music or audio in general can follow like two paths, let's say. So one is a more traditional path, and this is like generative music from its inception, let's say towards like the end of the 50s until 2000, 2010. So your typical generative music models at the time were based off of traditional AI algorithms. So not really machine learning data driven, but rather rules driven. So in this space, we like to refer to this type of implementations like good old fashioned AI. So this is like what came before machine learning and deep learning. So here we're talking about those models like expert systems, generative grammars, and a bunch of other things that you can have that, right? And so these models are based off of the music knowledge that we have and that we can transfer, so program directly within a piece of software, right? So this was like the typical way of doing generative music before the advent of machine learning. Then we had machine learning and more specifically deep learning. Now, all of a sudden, it's not the composer, it's not the programmer who sort of like programs all the rules within a certain program, but rather is the program itself that figures out the rules and extracts the patterns from the data. In other words, I have a deep learning model, so it could be a neural network, and I pass a lot of data. For example, in the symbolic sphere, like I could pass a lot of like MIDI files, let's say of Bach chorales, right? It's your typical like Hello World application for generative music. So you pass all of the MIDI files of all the Bach chorales into a neural network, and then the neural network hopefully will figure out all the rules and patterns hidden within Bach's music, right? And in this way, the model learns by looking at data just by itself. This is a great thing, and it has allowed us like to create things that would be unthinkable right? So, for example, if you listen to like Suna's results or 11 Labs results, right, they directly generate music in the audio space. So they directly generate like waveforms, and it would be basically impossible to come up with rules, human-made rules to actually like generate waveforms. It's just impossible because it's too complex. Okay. So there's a huge advantage in using these deep learning models, these data-driven models, but they come with a certain limitation. And the limitation that they have is that they don't afford enough control to the end user. In other words, they are kind of black boxy. So we really don't know what's going on, and it's difficult to control them. And when they generate things, they tend to be like really, really wild, right? It's like a super wild horse, and you need to direct that horse in a direction that makes sense for the horse race, right? And my idea basically is to combine both like good old-fashioned AI, so the more traditional models, also called like symbolic-based models, with deep learning, so that we're going to have like this neuro-symbolic integration. So we're going to have hybrid models that leverage the power of deep learning models, so neural networks, and here's the neural part in neurosymbolic, but at the same time that they are controlled to a certain extent by good old-fashioned AI models, so models that rely on symbols and that manipulate symbols. And the great advantage of that approach is that you're going to have, in the end, algorithms that a musician could relatively easily control, which is, I think, the most important missing piece of the puzzle so far.
Yeah. So in like music theory, when you start to learn how to compose melodies, for instance, a common approach is to use some large melodic leaps, a lot of stepwise motion, some skips, and often a contrary motion downwards after you've gone upwards, for instance. And those are some sort of rules one could encode in your good old-fashioned AI system. Whilst in a neural system, you would just give the system a lot of melodies and let them figure it out for themselves. So you're saying one could combine both rule-based, some symbolic systems, and the wild horse that is the neural network together.
Absolutely. And there's quite some interesting research in the space. And this is also like research that I've been doing like for quite some time, and it tends to work like way, way better, especially if we are dealing with symbols. Now, there's a little bit of ambiguity using like the term symbol here, because it means two things in this context. So symbolic music generation means generating like music that has a symbolic representation, like for example, MIDI or piano roll representation, right? But then we have like symbolic AI, and those are algorithms that use symbols and manipulate symbols somehow. So just we should be aware like of these two distinctions. But yeah, I totally agree like with what you said. And as I said, like there's a lot of research that pushes, well, not really a lot, but there is some research that pushes in this direction. And in my experience, this is like what tends to work better, especially in the symbolic representation space. So whenever we're dealing with like scores or MIDI or piano roll representation. And to your point, let's say like you have a melody generator, right? So one of the things that have been experimented is to basically come up with an initial melodic idea that is very well structured through some rules, right? Because one of the drawbacks of neural networks is that they are wild horses, meaning like that it is very difficult to let them create, for example, like melodies like that are self-consistent and self-coherent. So in other words, like that they are structured in such a way where you have, okay, so you have like this initial, let's say like theme here that gets repeated, and then the two themes get like developed, and now I have like the level of a phrase or a semi-phrase, and semi-phrase A is followed by semi-phrase B, which has like contrasting material, but then this is encapsulated at a higher level of abstraction into the phrase level, and then now I have like phrase 1 and phrase 1 prime. That's just a variation. So this level of like fractal structure within the music, it's very difficult to capture with a wild horse algorithm as a neural network. But this is where like a symbolic like generative algorithm can help you like quite a lot. So you can come up with rules like to generate the sort of backbone of this melody that's consistent. And then you can basically use that as an input to a wild horse algorithm, to say a transformer, a neural network. And now all of a sudden you can use that transformer to add complexity and variety and interest to a melody. And this tends to work quite well because you have the best of the two worlds, really. And at the same time, the really good thing about an approach like this is that you are the one who can actually set up the parameters for the initial generations, and you can also set up the rules. So you may have a product or an algorithm where you have the flexibility to say, hey, I want this level of, I don't know, like, let's say harmonic complexity or like chromaticism or density in this melody, right? And then that will allow like any composer to have like more control over the generation process, which I think in the end is the most important thing, and that right now is actually missing.
Yeah. Often as a composer, you could get a good idea, a riff for a bit of a melody or something, and then you don't really know where to take it. So that would be a great addition to the toolbox to be able to input that idea and then get loads of variations, reharmonizations, rhythmic complexity, and actually be able to adjust the parameters as you were saying by yourself. Google Magenta, last time I tried it, it had I think it was only one parameter you could adjust, which was temperature, which was kind of how wild it was. And basically, that experience for me at least was you could choose between wild or real extremely bizarre wild. So it didn't really give me any feasible results. It was just completely crazy.
Oh yeah.
But if one were able to control parameters on a more nuanced level, that would be really great.
Yeah, I think if I can just quickly add here, the problem with those type of models, the wild horse models, is that like for example, the temperature parameter that you had with Google Magenta's plugin. Well, that is a parameter that comes directly from the model, the deep learning model. I think like it's probably like a LSTM RNN. And so you have like that temperature parameter that you can use, but that is part of that architecture. So it doesn't really have much to do with music theory at all. What I'm talking here instead is having parameters that are really, really connected to concepts in music theory. Of course, you may have also like different levels of abstractions where you're going to just, let's say, show higher level concepts to semi-professionals. Like, for example, I don't know, like the mood. So like the type of mood, like a melody or a certain harmonization may be, or things like how complex things that are a little bit more understandable by people who don't necessarily have like that music theory grammar. But the moment we transition to professionals, it could be like film composers, it could be producers, what have you. But at this point, we can also tap into music theory related things, like say, yeah, I want some music that has a lot of chromaticism. I want some music that has like this percentage of tonic, like in the mix, in a chord progression, or I want it to be like way more atonal, let's say, right? So if you can start to speak the very same language that most of these like music professionals would actually understand. It's a little bit like the way I think of it is a little bit like a synthesizer where you have a lot of knobs and levers that you can use in order to craft the perfect sound that you have in mind, right? So if I want a particular sound, I know that perhaps I have to use a sine wave, right? Or I have to use like this filter or this reverb. So it's different ingredients, right? And so you can mix the ingredients differently in order to get like what you want. So that works very nicely, for example, with subtractive synthesis, but it could work more or less the same way with a proper interface with generative music.
Yeah. And then synth players, when confronted by this, for instance, like with software which can re-synthesize sounds, you would maybe ask them, do you want to use this software? You can re-synthesize that particular sound. And the really good synth players would probably answer, why would I do that when I can do it myself? Just twisting, attacking, delay, and those sorts of things. And probably a composer would say the same thing right now, but maybe in the future, one would perhaps not necessarily need to learn that part of the craft anymore if you could do it with a model instead. Do you think the future musicians and composers will be less versed in the craft of making music than they are now?
No, I don't think so. I just think that AI is just another tool in the composer's palette. And if you think about the history of music, and I'm writing a book about the AI music revolution, and there's a chapter, I think it's chapter number 2, where I go through the history of music sort of like in a nutshell. And the point that I tried to make there is that the history of music is a history of technological revolutions and technological development. So imagine in prehistoric times when the first human being found that they could use like a pipe to generate sound, right? Now, all of a sudden, they've externalized music making to a tool that they can leverage to amplify an idea that they have, a musical idea, right? So already a pipe is an amplifier, a creative amplifier. Then you move on and you have like the pipe organ, you have, let's jump like hundreds, if not thousands of years. And then you start having things like electric guitars or things like synthesizer, sample sounds, right? And all of these things, what they do is they just afford you more creative options. And I think that AI is just another link in this super long chain of music technology in the end, right? And so I don't think composers or producers will be less music savvy just because there's AI. No, I think quite the opposite. Now composers have the opportunity to leverage, let's say, more or less creative intelligence systems that can help them streamline the compositional process. So for professional composers, I think like the advantage of using AI will be just like streamlining the process and at the same time using them as sparring partners. Because sometimes you have writer's block. We've always had it whenever like we write something or we compose something, right? You have that thing. Now, having a companion that can be there and suggesting like a few options could be like a really, really good, valuable resource to have in order to streamline the process and breaking out of composer's block, which is a real thing. And there's also like another thing that I think is extremely interesting for AI in music, and that is potentially creating a type of music that was not possible earlier. Let me explain. I'm talking about interactive music or adaptive music. And I'm gonna just like make an example with video games because like that's what I know and that's what I've done, like also like with Melodrive, but I think like it's quite fitting. Now, if you take a huge game like Skyrim, like this huge like fantasy games, like people can spend thousands of hundreds, if not thousands of hours in them, right? Problem is that at the end of the day, the soundtrack is going to last those like 5 to 10 hours, like what have you, but not more than that usually, right? And that's just like normal because you can't ask a composer to write 1,000 hours of music. That's just logical. But now, what if you had a model, an AI that could actually take your ideas, musical themes, as input and then implement those ideas in real time and change them depending on the type of emotional feedback that the AI model gets from the game and of course like from the user. So that is going to create a sort of like infinite stream of music that's always perfectly fitting the particular emotional context of the video game. So this is like for all sorts of like interactive content, not just video games, but also virtual reality and augmented reality applications. Beyond that, we can also think of other types of music where, for example, there may be a sort of newly found relationship between a composer, songwriter, and their fans, where you have an AI that actually re-implements the initial musical ideas of the songwriter, the composer, in such a way that maximizes like the interest of that particular user. Perhaps like having an orchestration and instrumentation that just is in tune with whatever like particular genre that fan is usually into. So now all of a sudden you may have, let's say, a Beatles song in a reggae style or a Bob Marley a song in a, I don't know, a grunge style, for example, things like that, right? And I think like this is like a really, really interesting like discussion to have, and it's going to open up situations that are just impossible without AI.
For sure. Do you see any downsides to such a development?
Um, One of the downsides that I see is that there's going to be possibly a huge influx of music, relatively low quality to like mid quality music. And we already have a ton of that, right? Made by humans. And now all of a sudden we're going to have that, the human made one plus the AI made one. But I think at the end of the day, probably what's going to end up being is a market divided into different brackets. So you're going to have, let's say, players like Suno, 11 Labs, or Udo, which are going to provide models for non-musicians just like to create this half decent music, and that's all they need, like really in the end. And they just probably don't want to create like the next like huge hit or the next like Beethoven symphony. They don't care. They just like care to express themselves creatively through the help of an artificial intelligence. But this of course is going to result into billions and billions of songs or sections of songs pumped into the market. But again, I don't think that this is going to touch the more like creative part of the market. Let's call it like the higher end of the market, where there's going to still be, of course, like the craft of a human being behind most of the creations.
Yeah. One take might be that as the public gets exposed to a lot of, let's say, generic music, kind of a bit boring music, entertaining but boring, they might be even more interested in really creative, more out there kind of music as well.
I think this is a terrific point, and this is something that I've been sort of rehearsing in my mind for quite some time, and thinking that, so if we're going to end up having a ton of already heard music, because at the end of the day, especially like this type of algorithms that we have these days, all they do is like recreate music in the style that they've been exposed to. So they can't create a new music genre by themselves. So they're just going to spit variations and re-elaborations of like what they've already seen. If you live in that world, now all of a sudden, perhaps even the music makers will be pushed to create something that's outside of the typical music content that you get out of these models, which perhaps in a sense could facilitate a new musical renaissance just because of the need of being unique and outside of the AI bubble somehow. I think this could be an interesting thing to see. And I don't know like if it's gonna sort of like go down in this direction, but it's definitely a possibility that I see there.
Yeah. One of the examples you mentioned earlier was that you could adapt the music to different moods and such, and that might be fall into the category of music as entertainment. Since it's kind of catered to the user's needs, and some artists will argue that art is really something that is not necessarily entertaining, but is something that pulls you out of your comfort zone and is something different than what you were expecting, or something different than what you wanted. You know, that's where real art lies. Could you imagine using, or how one would use AI tools to make art that kind of takes you out of your comfort zone?
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to mention that I guess 90% of the, or 99% of the music that we have on the charts these days doesn't belong to the category like that. In my opinion, at least, like doesn't belong like to
Yeah,
that
completely
like
agree.
category. I mean, like I come from classical music, so I have like a completely like different sort of like, let's say, like understanding and opinions, like in terms of like what makes artistic music artistic, right? But beyond that, I think one could like make the case for having an AI that actually helps you like generate things that are outside of your comfort zone. I don't know, like if you've seen some of the cool experiments that some artists like have already like made like with AI. So for example, there's a group like of friends like Data Bots. I don't know like if you know them. Like they've been playing around like with audio based generation, I think like for 5-6 years now. And like a few years back, like they were like coming out like with this like crazy ass sounds like that were super, super interesting and kind of like completely like unheard of. And so, and they could create like those sounds slash almost compositions by using like this weird like models, audio based models, right? And I think that they also had a very, very nice collaboration with a beatboxer.
Big
uh
bots.
bit boxer. I can't remember like his. It's basically like when you start like using like your mouth like to generate like weird sounds like things like that, right? I think like it's called like beatboxing, something like that, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah.
But they had this really, really cool collaboration where this guy, with the help of databots, like trained a databots model uh, on his beatboxing like performances. And so you had this sort of like collaboration and dialogue in a piece of music between the human beatboxer and the machine beatboxer, which was a sort of like in silico variation of the human. And the result was stunning. Really, really interesting things on the edge. Also, another thing is that many of these models that do not want to actually recreate your typical like pop music, rock music, like perfectly, tend to create things that are quite noisy with a lot of artifacts, like quite weird. And there you can leverage that weirdness to create things that sound really, really cool and otherworldly. So there's a lot of opportunity there. It's just a matter of having like the right ideas and the right creative approach and open mindedness in order to integrate that input that comes from all of these models.
Yeah. I was just now, as you were talking about it, envisioning a world where microtonal music perhaps is
Oh
more
yeah.
prevalent, or maybe in like a post Neuralink world where you maybe one expands the limit of hertz one can listen to, and then you could leverage AI to make interesting music in like a large spectrum of sound, basically.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
But in your opinion, who are the top people or institutions or companies in the AI music field right now? Who's doing the most interesting stuff?
Yeah. As I mentioned, I think at the level of text to music, I would say 11 Labs. So probably they are the ones like that have at the moment, at least like that we know of, the most advanced model out
Yeah,
there, text to music model for sure. In terms of academia, there's a few research groups out there that are really, really good. I think there's definitely like music technology group in Barcelona, the one that I'm collaborating with. Like they do like some amazing work like in the AI music space, and they are starting to tap into generative music ever more, which is super cool. And I think another research group like that's worth like checking out is the Center for Digital Music at Queen Mary University. They also have like a really, really strong group in AI music. I would say like most academic research happens in Europe. That's not obviously like completely true, but there's a lot of like centers of excellence in AI music, especially like generative music here in Europe. But then there's also like another really, really cool research group, and it's in Canada, Simon Fraser University, and it's led by Philippe Pasquier. They're, they've been doing like some great work in generative music before it was all the rage. So yeah, I would say these are more or less like the people, institutions, and companies that are sort of like leading the charge.
yeah, nice. Thank you. Maybe you could send me a list
Oh yeah,
afterwards, because it was a bit difficult to write down as you were saying it.
yeah, absolutely.
Do you know the? Have you ever heard about the YouTuber Adam Neely?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he had an episode where he talked about a bit about AI, and he said that he thought we would never get human level musician robots because of incentives not being lined up to make such kind of robots. I don't know if you saw that with that video.
No, I haven't watched that video in particular, but I'm always a little bit skeptical when people say AI is not going to arrive at this level. It's not going to arrive like at that level. I mean, we've seen it with ChatGPT and I would say like large language models in general. So if you take them as they are right now on a huge amount of test, university level test, they score better than the majority of students, which is incredibly impressive, right? And I think there's something very human about these positions, and it is I just don't want to become obsolete. So that's the sort of like underlying tone that I hear every time I hear, well, but machines are not necessarily like creative and they can't reproduce like what we can do. But I would actually disagree with that type of argument. And the reason is I don't think that there's anything special about us as human beings in terms of our creative capacity. At the end of the day, like we have a brain which sort of responds to very mechanistic laws. And so there's no soul, there's no romantic genius kind of thing. No, there are like processes and processes like that can be captured and reproduced also in silico through machines. And just like to give you an example, I'm a huge fan of a book that came out, I think like it was like in the mid 70s, something like that. It's called like Gödel, Escher, Bach. I don't know like if you know the book. It was like
Oh.
a super hit, fantastic book by I think like a Hofstadter is the author, an amazing mathematician, logician, and he was like sort of like going through like logic and comparing it like to the paintings like of Escher and the music of Bach. And towards the end of this book, he had a section where he would make like some guesses about like where AI is going to be in a few years. And I still remember that there was a passage where he said, we're not going to have chess AIs that are going to be as strong as chess grandmasters until these machines are going to be able to feel what we feel, see what we see, and live like what we live. Of course, like this is not verbatim, like the very same like quote, but more or less like this is like gist of it. It turns out that less than 15, 20 years later, so we had Deep Blue, which actually won against the chess world champion of the time, the incredible Garry Kasparov, right? And right now, it's impossible for a human being to even hope to win against a chess machine, chess AI, right? All of this to say that machines are capable of performing at human or even uber-human level. The great thing about music creation is that there isn't such a thing as uber-human level just because it's so subjective. It's not a game like chess. There's no you win and you get 1 point, you draw, you get like half point, and you lose and you get 0 point. No, it's very, very open. So in that respect, I don't think we're going to ever have like machines that are better composers, better musicians like that. Humans, just because it's very difficult to create that kind of ranking there.
Yeah. I might have botched the explanation at the beginning a bit, because Adam Neely's point wasn't that he doesn't believe that AI could reach the level of humans, because he absolutely thinks it can, but that the economic incentives for companies aren't aligned with making robots capable to play music in a live setting as well as humans, because it's a lot cheaper to just have humans do it than to make robots that could do the same.
Well, I have to say that in the history of humanity, I think like it's actually the right thing is always like well, not the right thing, but the answer has always been like the opposite, right? So if I can automate something, like I tend to automate that thing, and that has sort of like economic incentives. So I don't see like any major difference like in this case. So I don't know like if these robots are going to be like hardware based, so like kind of like robots, like with bolts and metal, or if it's going to be just like virtual instruments and things like that. But I do think that there's already quite a lot of competition in the generative music AI space. So I'm assuming like that certain companies probably will see an economic benefit going down that route. Again, I don't know like if they're going to be like humanoid robots or if it's just going to be like software programs. But I honestly like, think that we're going to get there sooner than later.
Do you think you will go to a concert featuring a quartet of robots playing like Kansas cover or something in your
Uh,
lifetime?
I think it's going to be super, super cool, especially if I have the luck of designing yeah, those systems. Well, by the way, if we're talking about, let's say, like a robots that perform a string quartet, that is going to be way, way harder
Yeah.
to do just because of like the complexity of, I mean, like performing a string instrument or things like that. It's incredibly like, complex, but the compositional production side of things, I think it's going to be there relatively soon.
Yeah, I think so as well. So it's a lot more expensive to make robots that
Oh yeah,
can do all the movements and stuff.
oh yeah.
So I guess Neely's point is that it's just way cheaper to have humans do it. But
For the time
at
being.
some point you'll probably have for the time being, probably at one point a robot can do anything basically. So it won't be designed to play a violin, but it can do that
Mhm.
as well as play ice hockey or whatever. Maybe.
Yeah, it's likely. Yep.
Um, I recently saw you post on LinkedIn about creativity,
Mhm.
and I think the question was if people thought a machine could be creative, and there was one guy named Fahim Hassan who gave an answer which I thought was quite interesting. Um, So I was thinking I'll read his answer, and then you could make a comment on that comment.
Oh yeah.
So he says, to add my thoughts here as a multi-instrumentalist musician, I would say that the end goal of making music is not so much the recorded WAV file to share with the world, but rather the journey of capturing one's emotional state and channeling that into something worthwhile that has meaning for the artist as well as their audience. In that context, making art is purely an emotional act of discovering and transmuting one's own feelings that come from the experiences of life. Machines can definitely execute the mechanics of music making, but unless we have machines that are living emotional lives and need to channel their emotions in some way, I don't see the output as anything worthwhile in an artistic context. Making art allows us artists to make sense of the world we live in and derive meaning from the process of creating something. In that sense, I feel that machine creativity will always lack that direct emotional experience that fuels the very intention to create.
Yeah, it's a very interesting comment, and it sounds a lot like Hofstadter's comment on chess, right? Until we get machines that are able to leave emotions and experiences, then we're not going to have a chess AI that's going to be better than, let's say, like a grandmaster, a chess grandmaster. In that respect, I don't think that that's necessary for a machine, and I don't think that that's gonna be a problem for the output of the machine. Because at the end of the day, the user, I think, is the one. Well, user in this case should be like the listener. The listener is the one who projects the emotions and projects the, the meeting, the meaning onto the song, onto the composition. So I think, and indeed, take a song, even like with lyrics, and now ask different people to give you an interpretation of that song, right? To break down that song for you and to just like tell you the type of emotions like that they've experienced. You'll hear a lot of variance there. There's going to be a lot of like different comments and different ideas about like that song, depending on who's talking about like that song. And the reason is because like art, like is very, especially music, is very loose from a semantic standpoint. And so people are able like to project onto like that piece of art, that piece of music, whatever, like their internal world. And I think like this is like what happens. So it's a little bit like when you look up at the sky and you see clouds and you start seeing patterns that obviously are not there. You start seeing like familiar faces, or perhaps a car, or perhaps a tree with a cat that's running on top of a tree, right? It's you, it's your internal world finding patterns. We are finding pattern finding machines in the end, right? And because of that, I don't think that's required a level of emotional input on the side of the creator in order for the listener to find or experience that level of emotion. And by the way, like the machines that we have right now, like Yudio Suno, we could assume that they have internalized a certain level of emotion as part of the composition and the production, just like ChatGPT has internalized the meaning of words, even if at the end of the day it really doesn't understand the meaning, but it has internalized like those patterns and can leverage them. In the same way, I believe like that a system like Suno's or 11 Labs does something similar to that. Of course, it's not perfect, but it does it like in a decent way, because like all of that information regarding emotions, internal like worldviews, and are somehow, I would say, hacked into the output of the music that has been used like to train the models. So it's something that probably those models have internalized without having like a real understanding like of that. Now there's another point. So on the side of the listener, I don't think there's going to be like a huge difference just if we just look at the output. But music is not just the output. Music is also the interest that a listener has in the creator. We don't just follow, I don't know, like Taylor Swift, Pink Floyd, or whomever for their music, but also for what they represent as a human being, right? And we cheer when they cheer, and we cry when they cry, right? And of course, this part is completely missing with all the models that we have right now. So that is on the side of the experiencing, so the processing music. But then there's the other side, which is the creation. And I strongly believe that we have an urge to create music, right? Because music is just a medium for us to express our internal like worldviews, internal states and emotions. And this is something that's going to be there regardless of whether like we have, I don't know, like AI Beethoven or AI Taylor Swift. No, that process is going to stay because we have a need to express ourselves creatively. And we've seen this with all the other previous technological revolutions, like, for example, the advent of the digital audio workstation that all of a sudden opened up the possibility of producing music to millions, tens or hundreds of millions of people who started to create music, and they couldn't create that type of music earlier just because the technology wasn't there. So the more we give people a facilitation to music making, and the more people we have making music, and that's going to stay there regardless of whether we have Taylor Swift AI and Beethoven AI or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of ingrained in the human experience.
Absolutely.
And also something I was thinking about as you were talking is I think it's a quote from Wynton Marsalis, which is a jazz musician and educator, who's in an interview he's asked if the music is for the musician or for the listener, and his answer is the music is for the listener, but the first listener is the musician.
Yeah.
It's quite a clever quote. So. So probably yeah, people are interested in the filter that is the artist and their take on the world,
I think so.
it's already a very developed term in popular music, authenticity, and its importance. It doesn't seem like that's going away anytime soon. I have one last question for you, Valerio, because I work at an educational institution and we're supposed to advance technological innovation practices in higher music education. Do you have any opinion on how we should go about doing it, or how people in music education should deal with AI tools in general?
Right. So I'm not an expert in education. Yeah, of course, like I make tutorials, courses, and things like that, but I am by no means an expert in it. But like, if I were to give you like my 2 cents, is just embrace the technology, because the technology is going to be there no matter what, right? If you don't embrace it, then it just means that your students are going to be disadvantaged the moment they get out of the education bubble, right? And they get in the real world, because the real world is using and will be using this type of technology. So this is true for AI music, but also for AI in general. Tools like ChatGPT, Perplexity, I like my 2 cents again. Like it's just like embracing them, because at the end of the day, I see like a clear parallel here with the advent of Google back in the day, right? I guess like I was a little bit like too young like to actually like remember that on an academic like level, but still probably I was like in high school like when it came out, and there were a lot of teachers were mad at it, because like they thought, okay, so now we have Google, so we're gonna lose like the ability to search for information, which was like highly praised. But now, 20, 25 years later, we just like found out that all Google did was facilitating research at a level which was incomparable with what like we did earlier. Imagine just like the hassle of finding like papers in a library, like with limited amount of articles, and now doing the same thing in Google Scholar, or just like using a simple Google search. And I think like the same thing will happen with AI based tools, in particular in the AI music niche or the music niche. I think what's going to possibly happen is the appearance of new products that are going to help students with, like, let's say like you are majoring in classical music, let's assume, right? So one thing like is counterpoint. Perhaps you're studying counterpoint, so now all of a sudden like you have an AI music tool, AI counterpoint tool, that helps you like find like the best counterpoints, and that helps you with like real-time feedback like on all like the counterpoints like music like that you write, this kind of thing. And I think like this is going to be instrumental to sort of like streamline the educational process. And I think if done correctly, this can be yet another tool, because at the end of the day, AI is another tool. It's a very smart one, or at least like some of these tools tend to be like quite smart, but it's just a tool. And as such, we should use it and embrace it.
Great. Well, it's been a great honor to have you on the show, Valerio.
It's been a
Thank you so
pleasure.
much.